please. Deputy Howlin. Can we have silence for Deputy Howlin?
Taoiseach, I met a man in Cork yesterday who was working in that city but can't afford to pay rent in that city. If you think that's funny, Minister, I don't. He didn't.
I think it's hilarious.
He's commuting daily from Dunmanway, 54 kilometres each way. Hilarious, isn't it? That man can't rent in the city that he works. And that story is typical of many people who've been failed by Fine Gael's strategy for the rental sector, the policy that introduced rent pressure zones. The effect of the rent pressure zones is, I quote, to limit rent increases both within existing tenancies and between tenancies to 4% per annum for a specified period, end quote. Yet the housing affordability crisis is getting worse. Over 10,000 people experience homelessness right now. Since the policy was brought in, we've seen more and more areas designated as rent pressure zones because rents have been shooting up in the areas alongside of the rent pressure zones, Galway, Maynooth and Drogheda. Housing officers in local government have told me directly that rent pressure zones are the single worst thing that has happened to the private rental sector. Rather than capping rents, the policy has given a signal to landlords to increase rents by 4% per year. Their expectation is that every landlord is doing the same thing, so they should too. We have rent inflation of 4% in the rent pressure zones, but rents outside of them, contiguous with them, are even worse. The policy is a failure. And the reason for that failure is that the benchmark used for rent affordability is wrong. Affordability must be benchmarked against earnings, what people can actually afford to pay. Average annual earnings for full-time workers grew by 1.7% between 2016 and 2017. Rents in rent pressure zones are capped at 2.5 times the growth in earnings over the same period. That makes no sense whatsoever. The minimum wage set by government rose by 1% in 2017 and another 3.2% in 2018. The minimum wage, in turn, affects sectoral wages in cleaning, in security, in retail, hairdressing and other low-paid occupations. Many people working in these areas are renters. Your government is setting wage increases at far less than the 4% rent increase that you are not only tolerating but in many cases encouraging. You're effectively encouraging a 4% annual increase in rents. Why did no one make the link between a proposed cap on rents and actual increase in earnings? Who came up with a 4% figure? And can I ask you, Taoiseach, do you honestly believe that such a level of rent inflation continues to be acceptable or sustainable?
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. First of all, I acknowledge, as does everyone on these benches, that rents are very high in Ireland, and they're particularly high in our cities and have become unaffordable for many people who, as you say, have to opt for long commutes instead. That is why we brought in the rent pressure zones. They've only been around for a few years, and there is evidence from the RTB and the quarterly reports that they produce that rent increases are now moderating. You'll have seen that in the most recent report. They were never going to work overnight. It was always going to take time for them to work. But we can see now a slowdown in the rate of increases and even some falls in rents in the last quarter. But there's no amount of rent pressure zones, or rent caps, or rent regulations, or rent formulas that will solve this problem. They can help. They can alleviate the problem. They can make it less bad. They can act to treat the symptoms. But so long as there are more people who want to rent or need to rent than there are properties available to rent, then you're going to have a problem. It might appear in terms of rent price inflation. It might appear in terms of under-the-counter cash payments, which is what happens in countries that have very strict rent controls. It might appear in the form of people who can't find anywhere to rent at all and have to continue to live with friends or relatives because there's a waiting list for a place to rent. So the solution has to be one around supply. We need to make sure that there are more and more places available for people to rent, and that will moderate prices and bring them down. The last time prices fell, or rent prices fell in Ireland, was because the mismatch of supply and demand was corrected and there was more supply available than there was demand for rental properties. And that's why we've put such a huge effort into increasing supply. 18,000 new homes built in Ireland last year, aiming to have over 20,000 homes built this year, around 25,000 in fact. And that is the policy, is to make sure that there's a greater supply of housing. Social housing for people who are on the housing list, private housing for people to buy because most people want to buy their own home, and places available for people to rent. And any of those other measures, like rent caps, rent pressure zones, no matter what formula you use, are only treating the symptoms. They're not actually treating the problem. But symptomatic treatment is important while you solve the underlying problem, and that's why the Minister for Housing is bringing forward additional measures to strengthen the rent pressure zones, to make them more enforceable by giving more powers and resources to the RTB, to change the way they're calculated, so they're calculated differently outside of Dublin, because there are parts of the country that would be rent pressure zones, but they're not, because the Dublin rents distort things, and also to extend the notice to quit periods and other measures such as that, and also to extend the rent pressure zone rules to student accommodation, which I know has been an issue that Minister Mitchell O'Connor and Minister Owen Murphy worked very closely on, recognising the fact that many people in student accommodation have seen very big increases in their rents because they weren't covered by this legislation to date.
Taoiseach Deputy Howlin.
Of course, the issue has to be cured, and the cure is to increase supply. And there is a way of doing that quickly. We have public land, use public money to build public houses on public land. That should be done. But in the meanwhile, before we actually implement the cure, we do need to treat the symptoms. People are in pain. That pain has to be addressed and alleviated. And we've suggested that you have a national cap on rents, because people cannot afford the rents that are there. And if you have a national cap, you don't have this instant pressure on the next zone that is outside the current line for the rental pressure, that they can increase, as we've heard in one instance, by 30%, because they think, well, we'll be next. Have a national rental zone, link it to something sensible like the Consumer Price Index or wage inflation, not to an arbitrary figure of 4%, which makes it unaffordable. So I'd ask you, Taoiseach, yes, we do need to increase supply dramatically, and we need to see dramatic action as set out, for example, in our own proposals to deploy 16 billion euros to build public houses and affordable houses on public land. But in the interim, we need to allow people to continue to rent and not be in mortal fear of not being able to afford their rent or have to commute inordinate distances to keep in a job.
Taoiseach.
Thanks very much, Deputy. We agree that supply is the solution. We have a rising population, increases by about 1.5% a year. Very few countries in the Western world have a population increasing as fast as ours. And we also have an emerging phenomenon of smaller household sizes. So we need a lot of extra housing every year just to stay still. And we agree that supply is the solution to the underlying problem. And that's what we're doing. 18,000 new homes built last year. 1 in 4 of those new homes were for social housing, built by local authorities or affordable housing bodies. And I don't know when the last time it was that we built 1 in 4 houses for social housing, but that's what was done last year. Probably the biggest social housing programme in decades, and that needs to continue. We want to increase that to about 25,000 new homes this year. If we could ramp it up quicker, we would. Believe me, we would, but we haven't been able to. We did consider a year or two ago a national cap on rents, and there are a number of reasons why we concluded that that wasn't a good idea. First of all, we don't have a national rental market. Dunmanway is very different to Cork City, and Cork City is very different again to Dublin. So treating the entire country as the same when it comes to rents is a mistake and might actually do more harm than good. The other concern we had with a rent cap, as in 0 increases, is that it in itself might affect supply. And we know that in order to deal with this problem, we need more properties available to rent. We need people to actually rent out properties they own. And we had a major concern that by having a cap, it might actually reduce supply, thereby not allowing us to solve the underlying problem, which we acknowledge is supply.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Now